So what I'm going to talk to you today about is a project that was undertaken, funded by AgriFutures and Australian Eggs, and supported by PIRSA from South Australia. I need to acknowledge my colleagues, Mark Sexton, Angela Scott, Wayne Mossop and Kevin Wilkinson as part of this project. So the reason behind this project is to get the Australian poultry industries prepared for exotic diseases, is the background to this. We have had, as you know, exotic disease incursions in both industries over the years. And a big part of the response is to get the industry back up and running as quickly as possible, to get the individual properties up and running and to get the industry back to negative status for international trade as well. So it's really important that we have smooth systems in place so that we're not delayed at the pointy end of the problem, trying to solve problems on the run. So one of the things we have to look at is how to prepare ourselves for mass disposal, which is a very major part of the cleanup and recovery operations. There's three really important Ds, we call it, the three Ds of a operational response to an outbreak. Mass destruction, so we need to know how to euthanize mass numbers of birds very quickly. We need to know how to dispose of those birds quickly, and we need to know how to decontaminate quickly. So they're the three Ds of the operational response capability for an exotic disease outbreak. All of these are covered inside AusVet Plan. Now, for a bit of background, AusVet Plan is the Australian veterinary plan, which is managed by Animal Health Australia. And it's the guidelines essentially on how to overcome exotic disease and how to recover from exotic disease. You can see here, this is three examples of AusVet Plan manuals. Enterprise manual, which now this explains to those decision makers at crunch time when we have an exotic disease outbreak, how the poultry industry is set up, how it's structured, how it operates. So it gives a good background to the industry. Then we have disease strategy manuals for each of the key exotic diseases. One of there I've highlighted there is avian influenza, but we have disease strategy manuals for Newcastle disease, very virulent bursal disease, and those sort of things which are related to poultry. These aren't only avian manuals, there's manuals for all of the exotic diseases of all livestock species. And then we have the operational manuals for disposal, decontamination, destruction, which explains in detail the guidelines only, explaining procedures and options available for disposal, for example, in the event of an outbreak. So these are all manuals that are available for referral. They don't actually give any strict details. They are a guideline only, so they have to be referred to in that frame. Inside the disposal manual, it states in the opening of the manual that prior planning should be undertaken by animal health authorities in conjunction with all stakeholders, which includes the industry, to prepare for disposal operations. Now, it's very important to get preparation in place early. If you have a look as we walk through this project, you'll see that it's a very, very complicated process to decide how to dispose of large volumes. We're talking large tonnages. If we get an exotic disease outbreak in a large broiler growing complex, there's huge tonnages of both chicken, litter and feed that needs to be disposed of. And you can't do that on the run. Very, very difficult to plan. Right to the outbreak occurring, so that the trigger can be pulled quickly and we don't get delays in either destroying the stock or disposing of the stock or getting ourselves back into business. So for this project that we're running, we're looking at various options. We did a scenario, hypothetical scenario, to look at what options were available in order to be able to dispose of large volumes of chicken meat very quickly. And that looked at things like burial sites. What options were there both on-site and off-site? Because that's the number one decision we need to make. Do we dispose of this contaminated material on-site, or do we take it off-site? There's advantages and disadvantages in both. On-site, obviously, there's less chance of spreading disease because we are talking about potentially biosecure exotic disease material being transported off-site if we do have to go off-site. So there are advantages in disposing of product on-site. Another part of the project was to be able to develop tools so that producers, yourselves, when you're looking at your emergency management plans on your own facilities, can have a look at your own facilities, have a look at your own properties, and look for options on site for disposal of large volumes of biomass. So we did go through that process. We do have questionnaires that have been developed that allows you to have a look at your own property, your own scenario, your own farming operations, and see if there are options on your own property to dispose of biomass. It also helps the CCAD, which is the decision-making body, I guess you'd say, in managing the speed of response. If there is an outbreak, we don't want delays while people are debating and arguing and discussing what's the best options for disposal. It needs to be decided very, very quickly. It's a very complicated procedure to decide. I don't envy those people that have to make those final decisions, but it has to be done quickly. If we can do some preparations prior to outbreaks occurring, we'll certainly be able to speed that process up, get ourselves, both the affected businesses and the wider industries, back up and running in a much more timely manner. Okay, so the project outputs were to develop guidelines for producers and process on the development of on-farm preparedness systems, templates for on-farm mass disposal plans, so that on your farm, if you do have an outbreak and we do need to dispose of product on farm, where on your property can we do it? How can we do it? Do we have all the resources available to do it? Now, all those questions that need to be answered in a very, very quick manner. Okay, so this stage one of the project was to do an extensive literature review of disposal methods. Now, there's a lot of information out there in Europe and the US. Obviously, with avian influenza running rampant internationally, there is a lot of work going on disposal of livestock, biomass, and also for red meat, so foot and mouth outbreaks, swine fever, for example. There's been a lot of development on disposal methods. So there's a lot of information out there, not necessarily suitable to Australian conditions, but it certainly gave us some good insights on how to dispose of large volumes. We evaluated the currently available SOPs, standard operating procedures. Not a lot out there in terms of standard operating procedures. Some of the individual states have developed their own standard operating procedures, but there's no national operating procedures for composting, for example. So we had a look at that and highlighted there were some deficiencies in that area that needed to be reviewed. Also looked at the GIS capabilities, which is a geographic information systems. So each state has got GIS data available, and that's very good data that's available for producers to identify the key parameters on their own properties that relate to being able to, whether or not you can bury on site or do composting on site, for example. So we ran a hypothetical scenario using Port Wakefield in South Australia, which is an intensive broiler growing area. And out of that, what did we find? It's very, very complicated. It's a difficult procedure. There's a lot of information available, but it's very widespread information. It's not consolidated in any particular point. Pardon me, it does rely on a lot of local knowledge, and to be able to find that local knowledge and find the producers or the people with that local knowledge at the time is very, very hard to pull together. And there is quite a bit of overlap between jurisdictions and quite a few discrepancies between jurisdictional processes as well. So if we're looking at disposal of product, let's say that we've got an outbreak occurring, hypothetical outbreak occurring, and we're looking at disposal of large volumes of biomass. We're talking thousands of tonnes of chicken meat on a broiler operation, for example. It's not just a matter of where's the excavator, where's the hole, let's dig it. All of these things need to be taken into account. This is out of the operations manual of AusVet plan. If you have a look around that circle of issues that need to be taken into account, now, the disease itself is only one of the issues, whether it's a zoonotic disease. Now, is it going to infect people as they handle this product? Very important. Does the disease spread easily? Is it windborne? Is it not windborne? They're very important things. Environment, the long-term impacts, short-term impacts. We've seen that with outbreaks previously. If we haven't undertaken correct disposal processes, we end up with leaching into the environment, leaching into the water table. And so we can get water that is contaminated and no longer useful for livestock production. So we need to take all that into account. There's the social aspects, the local community aspects, health and safety of workers, what resources are available. You can see through that list there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account when we're looking at what factors need to be considered to disposal of volumes. Options for disposal. We have quite a few options for disposal. You can see on the list here: burial, rendering, burning, composting, anaerobic digestion, or other methods. So obviously not all are suitable for farming, for chicken farming scenarios, but they are all options that need to be considered and are considered in the face of an outbreak. If we do go off-site, a lot of issues with transport. Not simply a matter of where's the truck. We've got to consider the biosecurity. We need to consider the availability of transport. Where do we take the product when we do offload it? Is there enough rendering facilities in the local environment, or is there deep burial facilities in the local area that we can take product to? Do the workers and the contractors actually want to be involved? Now, are they going to get their whole facilities contaminated if we take contaminated product to a compost facility? Does their facility then become a contaminated site and undergo restricted trade because of that? So it's quite difficult to get all this organised in a short space of time. So looking at this hypothetical scenario at Port Wakefield, I'll just run through it very quickly. This is a typical farm at Port Wakefield, 12 shed broiler farm, 40,000 birds in each shed, so the numbers of birds on the farm quite high. The Port Wakefield region, this is a map of the Port Wakefield region. You can see that red central circle there is around the farm that we used as the hypothetical. So in that region, we've got another 9 farms within 5 k's of that property, and then another 6 farms within 10 k's of that property. So highly concentrated. And if we had an outbreak here that spread beyond the one farm, we're talking up to 5 million broilers that need to be disposed of, along with their manure and the litter, and along with any feed that might be on the site. So we're talking very, very large tonnages. Okay, so our hypothetical brought into case, a worst case scenario, I guess. 5 million birds need to be disposed of, 7 days to depopulate, with all things going very smoothly. Remember, we've got all these factors to consider. So we look at the disposal site. If we look at an on-site disposal site, these are all the things that need to be considered. The disease in question, the zoonotic risk of that disease. So that involves workplace health and safety and your staff safety. Is it going to infect people? The environmental survivability of the disease in question, of the organism in question, the transmissibility. So this is the technical issues related to the actual virus that we're dealing with. There's a lot of legislative restrictions on how things can be managed, biosecure things can be managed on farms or on properties. The soil characteristics. Is your soil suitable for deep burial? What's the permeability of the soil? The water proximity, the runoff destinations. If we have composting, where does it run off to? Is there going to be leaching into the groundwater supplies? All of these things need to be taken into account. Volumes and types of materials involved. Now, if you're going to compost, we do need a carbon source as well. Chicken doesn't compost very well on its own. In fact, it won't compost on its own. It needs a carbon source. So fortunately with broiler farms, we have litter, which can help with that carbon source. Not necessarily the case on layer farms. So I need to know if there's a source of carbon that we can find at short notice. It's available. Now in the Port Wakefield scenario, there's a lot of wheat stubble, I think it is, which is baled and stored, and that's kept for the sheep, winter sheep feed supply. Now, are people going to be willing to supply that carbon to an emergency disposal scenario if they want that feed for their sheep in the winter. So it may be there, but it may not be available to us. So there's a lot of other things you can see down that list there that need to be considered before we can decide on which site we can actually work with. Burial on farm, off farm or landfill. So there are options for burial. Brings into the issue of transport and the issue of contaminating other sites outside the infected property. Composting options inside the shed or outside the shed. Obviously inside the shed, your shed then becomes unavailable for decontamination until that product is taken outside the shed. But it may be a short-term option. You can start composting inside the sheds and move it outside the sheds or move it off-site when it becomes uninfectious. Rendering, there's not many rendering facilities in Australia that could take large volumes at short notice. So they all have commercial entities operating, running 24/7. So probably not available to us for large volume, short-term availability. Incineration, very slow, cumbersome, doesn't handle large volumes. Also have problems with hot air plumes with incineration, so it needs to be contained as well. So it requires quite a bit of equipment, quite a bit of carbon again to keep the process operating. Destroy and let lie is an option that has been considered and has been used overseas. If you don't have facilities to dispose of the carcasses immediately, is it viable to just leave them in the shed for a short period when we're overwhelmed? Has to be considered at some point, possibly, if the diseases are getting away on us. Okay, so a lot of questions need to be answered in that. If we are looking at on-site mass burial, these are the key criteria that are highlighted in the AusVet plan. So I've gone through those previously. Each one of those needs to be considered independently. When we have a look at the state guidelines and state regulations in terms of on-farm burial, just have a look at that first row there, proximity to drinking water supply. It's not the same, it's not consistent between states. So if you're in Western Australia, at least 2 metres separation from the bottom of the proposed pit to the groundwater level. South Australia, the site should be at least 500 metres from the nearest bore. Look at Queensland. If you're in Queensland, the site will not be within 10 kilometres of a town water intake and not be within 300 metres of a borehole. That takes a lot of our farms out straight away, within 10 kilometres of a town water supply. New South Wales, 200 metres from surface water. So each state has got its own different requirements. So it's not easy to understand just what your requirements will be without looking at the individual state regulations. On-site composting is another option. You may require licensing with your state EPA, depending on the volume of product that you're trying to compost. There are also strict guidelines, EPA guidelines for site location. For example, in South Australia, you need to be at least 1,000 metres from a use that is, from that is for sensitive use. So we've got floodplain requirements, restrictions, Mount Lofty Ranges water protection area, or not within 100 metres of a bank of a major water course. So there are environmental requirements in terms of composting. That's just the South Australian one as an example. So composting, extra carbon is needed. We did a bit of a hypothetical summation on what carbon's needed. So for that hypothetical outbreak, 5 million birds, saying average 1.5 kilos per bird across 8 farms, 7,500 tonnes of birds to be composted. We know that we need 1.5 kilos of carbon material for every kilo of bird. So we need 11,000 tonnes of extra carbon for composting. That's a lot of carbon. Fortunately, on a broiler farm with litter, we can do an estimate on how much litter's on the farm. And we found that there was 15,000 tonnes of carbon from the litter across all the farms. So in that scenario, we did have enough carbon available, including feed, which also does have carbon material in it as well. We did find that we had enough carbon to be able to do composting. But composting is not just a simple matter either, not just a pile and you pile it up and you walk away. There's actually quite a lot of science behind composting to ensure that you do get a good breakdown and we do get virus inactivation or deactivation. So there's guidelines also in the project we developed for composting. which need to be moved into standard operating procedures, so that should we do get to the point of needing to compost, at least we'll know how to do it. But then you need people with technical expertise that do know how to do it. It's not an easy, simple process, quite complicated to get it working right. The geographic information systems. Each state does have a geographic information system which you can access, but from our experience, you also need to be an IT expert in order to be able to walk your way around these systems. They are quite complicated and not easy to find the information that you're looking for. This is a map of that Port Wakefield area in South Australia that we use for the hypothetical. You can see it's a very good geographical map. What we can do then is do an overlay. So I've done an overlay here of that local area. You can see each of the farms circled. And that overlay is, you can see on the legend there, depth to the water table. So the darker green area, I'm not sure, and this is difficulty with these GIS maps. The darker green area, I'm not sure if that's A or B, based on the colour there. More than 200 centimetres to the water table, or more than 200 centimetres over at least 70% of the landscape, but shallower in places. I'm not sure. The other problem is that you can't drill down any further than this. That's as close as you can get without losing information on the sheet, on the map. So we can see there that most of those farms have more than 200, at least more than 200 centimetres between the ground and the water table, which is good information. But when you look at the requirements for South Australia, the base of the trench should be at least 2 metres above the water table. So when it says it's over 2 metres, we don't know if that's 2 metres or 5 metres or 20 metres. So it's, the information's there. It's not detailed enough for us to decide whether or not we can dig a hole to bury birds on those sites, because we just don't know whether that water table is only at 2 metres or it's at 12 metres, which would be sufficient. So there's information, it's not entirely satisfactory for our requirements, so it's very, very difficult for us to then make a decision on whether we can bury on site or whether we can't bury on site. Some of the outputs from the project, a biomass calculator, which helps you work out just how much biomass you do have at peak time on your property. So that's it's got some fixed numbers there, and it's also got some input numbers in blue there. So you can work out how much biomass you do have in order to be able to develop a product plan. We have a decision tree questionnaire as part of the project, and that will generate a report. As you can see on here, 3 pages of report here, and that gives the farm details and machinery available on farm, so you can add that in. Mass disposal calculator, which has already been calculated for you. And then if you look on page 2 there, is it within the water catchment area, 550 metres? Okay, so that's fine. And then you work your way through the recommendations based on the questionnaire answers. On-site burial based on your answers to the questions you can see there. So it goes through that questionnaire, goes through the criteria that are required for your site. So it links to the actual state that you're in, and comes up with a report as to whether you can bury or not on your site. So that's the project in a very quick nutshell. It is available on the AgriFutures website for your reference.